on, where the Manchester Regiment of Infantry and Lancashire Fusiliers, Salford Pals, joined in the bloodbath that was the Western Front. At home, their womenfolk swapped kitchen worktop for factory workbench and fitted German patented clockwork fuses to artillery shells, while incredibly the British government continued to write royalty cheques, 1 penny per fuse, to its enemy, the Kaiser. But Manchester's contribution to World War I was far greater than can be gauged by reading the names on the gravestones of northern France. Manchester fought the war as much with technology as with her men and women folk.
James Weizmann lived and worked in Manchester, and it was while he was a research scientist and Don at Manchester University that he discovered a revolutionary new method of acetone production. His new discovery averted a chronic shortage of acetone to British ordnance factories, as German supplies of chemicals used in the manufacture of high explosives dried up. At a meeting with Arthur James Balfour in the Queen's Hotel, which used to stand on this site, James Weizmann's contribution to the war effort was rewarded with the promise of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration. James Weizmann became the first president of that new state to be called Israel.
Post-World War I, when Queen Cotton and King Coal abdicated and slowed to depression, Manchester could lean on its growth industries, chemicals and electricity. Vickers in Trafford Park exported their electrical equipment all over the world, not least to the developing Soviet Union, and they got their engineers mixed up in a show trial for industrial espionage in the process. The 30s was a time when Ringway was developing its air transport services, including regular flights to Rotterdam, with the planes calling in at Hull Aerodrome, the home of Amy Johnson. They called there to refuel and pick up passengers. But air transport was still strictly the domain of the wealthy. The inequalities of industrialized capitalism had been revealed by Engels and his friend Karl Marx, using 19th century Manchester as an example, and they'd not been resolved by 1918. There were no homes fit for the heroes on their return from the Western Front, certainly not in Manchester, where 50,000 people were estimated to be living in overcrowded and insanitary conditions.
The Peterloo Massacre on St. Peter's Fields in August 1819 holds a notorious place in Manchester's history. In October 1931, that history could have been repeated when the National Union of Unemployed Workers demonstrated in their thousands against dole cuts outside Salford Town Hall. Many were arrested in clashes with the police. The next day, armed policemen guarded shops, banks and public buildings in Manchester, and the army was rumoured to be in the suburbs. A planned march on Manchester Town Hall was banned, and so a violent clash between Manchester and Salford's unemployed and the forces of law and order was only narrowly avoided.
In 1930s Manchester, the contrast between the haves and the have-nots was there for all to see, and while the affluent, well-dressed minority were taking Mediterranean holidays or partying all posh in their dinner suits, the majority looked on from the pavement. Elsewhere in Europe, the reaction was different. Fascism was on the move, motivated by the bitterness felt towards the Treaty of Versailles. In 1936, Adolf Hitler marched his soldiers into the demilitarized Rhineland, bluff worthy of a downtown poker player. Had the French and the Poles known that the Fairfax soldiers had no ammunition issued for their rifles, and that they had instructions to withdraw if met with any resistance, they might have reacted differently. But accession to Hitler's demands served only to encourage him. Children of German Jews started to arrive in Manchester as the acts of persecution in Germany multiplied. News of the situation was reported by the Manchester Guardian, a provincial newspaper read but reviled by Hitler after it once described him as a smaller man than Mussolini in charge of a larger nation. war clouds gathered and the unemployed found work once again in rearmament. For Metro Vickers, Britain's build-up of naval power meant contracts for Admiralty signalling equipment and other military hardware. In Germany, Hitler's economic program was slowed by a lack of foreign exchange, a situation eased by Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who assisted the National Socialist Reichsbank through its American branch, the chairman of which, incidentally, was the ex-US President George Bush's father. The money raised for Germany was spent buying arms from firms all over Britain and Europe. For Germany, it was to be guns, not butter, and any opposition to that diktat was cruelly suppressed. Soon Goering's statement to the people that butter will make us fat, but guns will make us powerful, was put to the test with the annexation of Austria in February 1938 and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia a few months later. There was to be peace in our time, but it was peace bought at the expense of appeasement and the betrayal of the Czech people, sold out by the major powers in 6 weeks, significantly before the concrete of the bunkers defending their frontiers could set.
Until I was 17 or 18, the war clouds hadn't begun to gather. By the time I was 19, we'd had Munich and Neville Chamberlain coming back waving his piece of paper, and then we began to fill sandbags, and there was some talk of evacuation. And some people felt that it was very wrong that Chamberlain exercised appeasement at that time. My own father and other people I knew felt that disaster had only just been postponed.
But in effect, Britain was taking no chances, and rearmament was underway in earnest. The manufacture of steel air raid shelters was ordered, and delivered free to householders if the wage earner earned less than £5 a week. But the explosions in Manchester at the beginning of 1939 did not herald the start of World War II. They were the work of another army in another war, the IRA. The 3 bombs planted in manholes in 1939 killed 1 man and wounded 2 others. But the annexation of Czechoslovakia did not quench Germany's thirst for expansion. And when she invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain declared war.
We turned up at school on it would be the 1st of September, that it was a Friday, I think, and there were some big red buses outside my school in New Moston. Now I went with my brother. I had a brother in the senior school. I was a junior then, but as we were brothers, I went with him. So I went with the seniors and we all got on this bus. Our mums had made us rucksacks out of old pillow cases and things, and with all our clothing. I mean, we were very hard up in those days. They were bad times really, just in the 30s. And most kids had things that their mums had made. Some had cases. We all had our gas masks, and we all got on this bus, and it was a great adventure to us. And we sat on the bus. I remember we were sat up on the top, and then we started singing, we're off in a motor car, and it was great. But gradually, as we got going, we've been going about 3/4 of an hour, we sort of tailed off a bit, and and people started to realise that they didn't know where they were going, and we didn't.
One day, they took us all from school down to this place called the Garrick Playhouse, which is still going on Barrington Road, Altrincham. And there in this room, they had this cylinder in the middle of the room with, I would imagine it was mustard gas coming out. And you all have to walk around this with your gas mask on, you see, in a circle. And there's an ARP warden in the middle there, checking you out as you walk around, And through it, I heard this muffled shout, "Is everybody all right?" "Yes, sir, we're all right." I wasn't all right, though, because mine started leaking. Round the mouthpiece, there's a tape. The tape must have been improper. And this mustard gas started coming in, you see now. "No, help!" I felt like somebody on the Titanic, just before it hit the waves. "Who was that?" And I put my hand up, a shaky hand. He says, "Get outside, quickly, that's a good lad." So I ran outside in my short pants and pulled this gas mask off, Oh, what a relief, eh?
What I do remember is this going to this room. Now, I think it was like the WVS, and we went to Preston. And we were given a bag with a tin of corned beef and a tin of, I think it was condensed milk, and probably other things, but they're the ones. Oh, and a bar of chocolate. We were given a bar of chocolate. And it was a big room. I can't remember, I think Peter and Jim were with us, but Molly and Margaret were taken quite early. And Peter and Jim must have been as well, but I can remember Francis and I sort of being there forever. And nobody came and took us. You know, people used to would come in and take children, and we were still there. You know, you didn't think, what's wrong with you, you know, and you sort of begin to look at yourself and you think, well, you know, I look all right, but nobody. And eventually it was very late because it was dark, although I know it goes darker earlier in September, but it was quite dark, and they came and took us in a car, and we were taken to a house on Garstang Road, and it was the Mears family.
I joined the AOP when the war broke out, and they enlisted me as a messenger boy to ride a cycle in case the telephones broke down or we had an air raid, to ride and deliver messages from our control, which was in Dickinson Road, under the Dickinson Road Library. And I had to run messages from there to the Central Library under the heading of Mr. Knowles, which was the chief librarian at that time. We didn't get any messages come through because we didn't get any telephone lines that broke down. But after that, I joined the Home Guard, and my job then was to parade along the roads of Wythenshawe, you see, looking for enemy parachutists, you see, and stopping cars and asking them for identification. But we didn't get anything there either.
As it turned out, the declaration of war came as an anticlimax for many, but not for those on the liner Athena, which had sailed from Liverpool with many of her passengers evacuated from Manchester, only to be sunk by submarine U-30 on the first day of the war. 112 people died. Thousands of Mancunians joined the emergency services, part-time wardens, ambulance drivers, AFS and WVS, spent evenings and weekends training for the worst. Blackout was imposed, mudguards were painted white, but the irony was that many more people were killed on blacked-out roads, initially at least, than by enemy action. Everyone had a granddad who had been in the last lot and seen the effects of mustard or phosgene gas. Had the expected gas attack materialized, an even greater irony might have been exposed. Some of the material in the gas masks was made by J.R. Roberts of Leeds, the asbestos manufacturers.
I remember the date when we collected gas masks. It was September the 11th, the day before my birthday, when I was going to be 13. And then, of course, nothing happened for nearly another year until the 3rd of September 1939. When the war first started, nothing seemed to be happening at all, you know. But I remember I was at school at the time, and I was 2 years before I started work. And the main feature at school was the fact that some of the teachers, some of the best teachers, of course, were being called up for the forces, and they're being replaced by sort of worn-out versions of teachers that had retired, you know.
I was what was termed a Bevan girl. When I got 17, like all young women, we had to decide either on the Land Army the forces, the munitions, or nursing. And my sister, she was 5.5 years older than I was. She'd already been in nursing, and she encouraged me to go into nursing. But before, I was 14 when the war started, and I had temporary jobs. And a little interesting job I had was an invoice typist for the flour millers in Warrington. They're called Fairfax. And they had a marvellous system. They loaded the wagons and they travelled all through North Wales, delivering all the national flour and the feed for the cattle. And they went as far as Mould and Oswestry. Now, I lived in the country. My father was clerk of works and built this Fleet Aeron base at Appleton. And then I left the country and came to Oldham to start nursing. And it was a terrible shock because I left all this beautiful country in Cheshire and came to this terrible, dirty industrial town.
The war to young people seemed quite exciting, and I wanted to go in the forces. I was the middle child, and I think I was a bit rebellious, actually. So I was agitating all the time that I wanted to leave home, mainly. And a friend had joined the Land Army earlier on. She was slightly older than me. So when I came up to my 17th birthday, I just agitated to go. I wanted to see the world. People seemed to be, you know, going different places. So I went up to Preston for an interview, and I enrolled in the Women's Land Army. But it was very difficult for a city girl. I had been used to city life. We only lived a quarter of a mile from Manchester city centre, and I'd been used to dance halls and things like that. And suddenly we go to this place where we have farm animals and horses. I mean, the only horses we'd ever seen in Ardwick were the ones that pulled the coal cart or the milk float or rag and bone men. I was most unhappy because the farmer was very rough. I'd never done anything so hard. Being a shop girl was very easy. You just stood behind a counter, but the sheer physical work of farm work, I mean, the whole idea was to release men for the army, and so it was a man's work you were going to do.
That Manchester would eventually be a target for the Luftwaffe was certain, despite predictions that the German bombers would not travel the Pennines and that Manchester's smoke pall would hide the city. After all, the Zeppelins of World War I had found Manchester, and Lufthansa airliners had taken reconnaissance photographs as late as July 1939 to help identify targets. In November 1939, Hitler issued his Directive No. 9, which formally identified Manchester as a target to be destroyed. But the worst that happened initially was a barrage balloon struck by lightning over Openshaw.
But for many in betrayed and occupied Eastern Europe, it was a different story. By December, the Manchester Guardian was reporting that 200 Polish Jews a day were being shot. Christmas and winter were cold. It was the phony war. Nothing false, though, about the sinking of HMS Royal Oak and HMS Courageous. Many of the ratings who drowned having been conscripted in the Royal Naval recruiting offices of northern cities like Liverpool and Manchester.
There was rationing with a weekly allowance of 2 ounces of fat, 2 ounces of tea, 3 ounces of butter, 4 ounces of margarine, 4 ounces of sugar, and extra cheese for vegetarians. The great cooperative warehouse in Balloon Street housed much of the nation's food, ready for distribution after its journey across the Atlantic, but it was a journey that was proving increasingly hazardous, not just from the German U-boats, but but also from magnetic mines, the battle against which was led by scientists at Manchester, who invented an anti-magnetic system, degaussing, which neutralized their effect.
You missed your friends. It was difficult to cater at home. My mother did very well with the rations that we had, but I myself would have liked to learn quite a lot of cookery at that time, but you couldn't afford to make mistakes with your cooking.
What I remember particularly about the food part was the dried egg in the tin you used to get, and I used to love it, mate. But that's all I ever recall eating. I don't recall anything else. Although they used to have a big black pan on the fire, an open fire, and there was always a pudding in it in a rag, boiling in that. But I can't recall what that was made of.
New Year's Day is this week. How about some good resolutions? I wonder. Well, why not resolve something you'll like? Save on bread, eat potatoes instead.
Everything was in short supply. A high-ranking Manchester City Council official was prosecuted for using government petrol in his daughter's wedding car. Wrought iron railings were cut from the city's streets, and every spare plot of land was turned into an allotment. There may well have been nightingales singing in Berkeley Square, but there were potatoes, cabbages and peas in Manchester's Piccadilly.
But over in France, things were going badly for the Lancashire Fusiliers, who were attempting to defend the perimeter around Dunkirk, and for the Manchester Regiment and the York and Lancs, who were left stranded with their equipment on the wrong side of the River Dial.
Victorious all over Europe in 1940, the Germans were convinced that an invasion of Britain would be successful. They'd made contingency plans. Dr. Six, appointed the head of the Gestapo in a conquered Britain, intended the organisation of a northern headquarters in Manchester. The Central Library was one of the buildings considered for it.
The LDV Force, Local Defence Volunteers, or Look, Duck and Vanish, as they became known before they changed their name to the Home Guard, was hastily formed and trained for the defence of Manchester's streets. For the propaganda cameras, they appeared to be well equipped. They were not. And if the German Blitzkrieg had really come to Britain, the Home Guard would have needed a little more than just a few sheets suspended on a rope across a road to stop the German panzers. Everyone contributed, whether it was by picking potatoes or producing parts for Rolls-Royce Merlin aero engines, powering the Spitfires and the Hurricanes of the RAF.
There was absolutely no social life. I mean, you worked until you almost dropped and then you were glad to get into bed. And at first light you were up again.
There were continual efforts being made for refugees as far as the war is concerned. I met refugee girls from Germany who had come over just before the war, who were scholars at the school where I worked. And one of the efforts this school made was to organise pea-picking camps at Ormskirk, which is towards Liverpool. And the girls went there certainly for 2 summers on the run to pick peas, and it was quite hard work.
The main thing I can remember at school was one day when we were all stood on the football field on one side. This German bomber came over, quite low, and really, when you were thinking, we're all looking up and looking at it, and he could have shot at us for all we know. I think we could nearly see the fellas inside it, you know. And about 4 minutes after he'd gone, 2 hurricanes came flying across at high speed, you know, after him.
But planes and tanks and ships had to be paid for, and the Manchester public responded by digging deep into their pockets for Wings for Victory Week, Salute the Soldier, and other fundraising activities. During Spitfire Week, Manchester and District bought at least 3 planes to help defend the skies against the Luftwaffe. But the wail of air raid sirens was nevertheless heard on the 29th of July and in early August, when incendiary bombs and a bundle of propaganda leaflets fell on Salford, right onto the head of a policeman on guard at the Civil Defence Central Office.
Sunday morning in September 1940, about 10 o'clock, 10:30, when we'd come back from Sunday school that morning, and the sirens went, and we had rather a large family, and so we all were marshalled by the eldest sister, ready to be head counted into the shelter, which was located under the house, when my father looked out to the east and said, "Oh, for goodness sake, get these kids in the shelter, look what's coming." And there, in the sort of middle distance, were 2 formations of what looked like aircraft heading straight over our house. And as we all sort of helter-skeltered into the safe haven, as it were, we realised these were skeins of ducks migrating. So, you know, it was rather an amusing incident. The other one was that there was an ACAC gun site opposite at a place called Jesson's Garage. It's now Charlie Brown's garage. And one day in 1940, one night it was, again the marshalling was taking place in the lounge for the head count. And I got locked out in the hallway when this gun went off. And I promise you, I've never screamed as loud as I did until they let me into the lounge on that occasion.
Once Auntie Jessie had seen us into the shelter, actually. She disappeared. And apparently she'd got a shovel of sand and she ran back through the entry, round to our front door, with the intention of doing something to put this incendiary bomb out. And she came back shortly afterwards. And when she came in the shelter, she was looking a bit contrite, but she was grinning. So some people in the shelter said, "What's the matter, Jessie?" She said, "Bleeding air raid warden." He said he told her to piss off out of it, leave the firefighting to the experts.
The lead up to Christmas, December, early December, we'd had the raid on Sheffield, early in December. We'd had a continuous number of raids on Liverpool for nearly a week, leading up to, again, to the end of December. And then we were hoping that there'd be a respite for Christmas.
Just after 6:30 on the 22nd of December, high explosives and incendiaries rained down on Manchester city centre, even before the wail of the warning sirens had died away. Almost immediately, Manchester city centre began to burn. Deansgate, Royal Exchange were engulfed in flames, while buildings in Princes Street, Albert Square, Clarence Street and Broadgate were blown apart and ignited by the cluster of incendiaries which followed the high explosive bombs. Water mains were fractured. The fire became so fierce that it would burn glass, stone, even metal. Within an hour and a half, the area around Exchange Hotel, Market Street, Victoria Buildings and St Mary's Gate was ablaze, and with a large percentage of Manchester's fire service having previously been transferred to Liverpool, the emergency services were overwhelmed.
that is very clear in my memory is that although there was a lot of noise, bombs falling, anti-aircraft guns firing from not very far away, and occasionally the earth shaking when a bomb dropped, the wonderful music of Handel's Messiah kept going through my head the whole night, particularly the words, "Comfort ye my people," and the others, the Hallelujah chorus, and the glory of the Lord. And I felt no fear through that night, although it was a terrible night for lots of people. But those songs just kept me going and kept me quite calm, and I'll never forget that.
The whole of the place exploded in light. By 10 o'clock, I was terrified alone, but by 10 o'clock that night you could actually read a newspaper in the street. And I was so frightened, I ran next door to a next-door neighbour, and they allowed me in their home until, you know, it seemed to go on forever.
But I can remember seeing Manchester, the sky at Manchester at night was just one red glow, and it was night after night after night.
And the next minute, there's this horrendous explosion. All the windows flew in. My dad flew in. We didn't find his cap for 3 days. That went right up the street somewhere, and they'd hit this factory just opposite our house, the landmine.
Bombed buildings began to collapse in flames, and communications to Salford were cut off, and buildings on Bridge Street collapsed. Warehouses in Watson Street and Portland Street burned like volcanoes. The reserve fire crews of the AFS were fighting a losing battle as Manchester streets became canyons of fire, fueled by over 37,000 incendiary bombs. 272 tons of high explosives had been dropped, and the inferno that was Manchester caused winds of hurricane strength as balls of fire leapt from one street to another. The raid lasted almost 12 hours, and when the bombers went home, the sun didn't need to rise, for the fires ensured that night had already become day. The emergency services coped as best they could, and they were rewarded by the rescue of 450 people in a street shelter in Erskine Street, where all the exits and entrances had been blocked by rubble and fire.
The sky across all Manchester was ablaze, flames and fire. And people were shouting in the streets and running. And they said, the whole of Manchester's been blitzed, it's been bombed. You've got to get out quick. And the boom of panic struck.
Nearly all of Piccadilly was ablaze when the bombers came over. The bombers came over and bombed it. And Hardwicks at the back of Piccadilly was really going some, it was really ablaze. And the firefighters, they had a terrible job trying to put that out, with fire bombs and things. And people trying to stamp on them to put them out, which was absolutely ridiculous, of course.
When I saw the devastation and the damage to Manchester, I felt very sad. To see particularly the lovely buildings that were at the top of Portland Street going up in flames was very sad indeed.
My most vivid memory is that nearly every house was damaged in some way. Nearly every window had been broken. I also remember seeing a shopkeeper whose shop was on a corner with 2 plate glass windows on either street, cursing in the middle of the road, and my father trying to put his hands over my ears to prevent my hearing the swearing.
I remember hearing shrapnel clattering along the dustbin lids in the back entry. Family, including myself, would hide on the cellar steps or under the mahogany table in the living room until the air raid passed. I have no memory of feeling afraid or terrorised. It was just something you had to do.
We could see it from Boston, over Manchester. And we could see the glow in the sky. and the planes going over continuously. And it would die down, and then it would suddenly blaze up again, the flames. Because Moston's 4 miles away from the centre, but we could easily see it. And this really went on continuously for 12 hours until about 5 or 6 o'clock the following morning. Well, we were going to go to work on the Monday morning, so we went into town on the bus. That was myself, my wife and her sister, because they worked at Baxendale's. So we got the bus as far as Thompson Street. That was where the garage was, and the buses stopped there. They wouldn't let anybody any further. So we walked on then down Rochdale Road to Miller Street corner. And then when we saw Baxendale's blazing from one end to the other, and we could picture the beautiful showrooms, with the magnificent furniture, glasswork, really priceless stuff, all being destroyed.
This was Miller Street, and that was the great building of Baxendale. Down at the bottom end of Market Street, St. Mary's Gate lies riven apart by high explosive bombs. The Victoria Arcade is in ruins, its buildings blasted and burned, its great dome shattered. This was the Oldham Road goods station, an important transport point. The roof is a bare skeleton of twisted girders. But over these bare bones, the sunlight of another day is breaking. It breaks on a Manchester that still lives and works on in spite of all this ruin.
But Manchester had barely time to draw breath, as at 7:15 on the 23rd, the sirens wailed again, as the Luftwaffe returned to finish the job they had started. But the raid only lasted until 1:30, and it was recalled by Albert Schmidt, pilot of one of the Heinkel 111s, tasked with the destruction of Manchester, flying from a base in occupied northern France.
Heute sollen wir Manchester wieder besuchen. Gestern wurden wir durch die Feuer in Liverpool zum Ziel gelangt. Heute jedoch können wir trotz Wolken im Himmel die Feuer sehen, die letzte Nacht in Manchester verursacht wurden. Bomben los. Die Straßen sind so hell, als ob es Tag wäre. Und unsere Bomben verursachen große Kreise gleißenden Lichts bei der Explosion. Wir sehen die riesige Explosion einer unserer Fallschirmlinien und können den Druck selbst in dieser Höhe spüren. Obwohl wir durch Zoomscheinwerfer geblendet werden, können wir immer noch die Feuer sehen. Wir brauchen nicht lange und um 1 Uhr sind wir schon auf dem Rückweg nach Büro. 2 erfolgreiche Missionen in 2 Tagen. Wir freuen uns auf Weihnachten.
When daybreak came, the people of Manchester crawled from their shelters and cellars to witness the destruction. 20,000 houses had been destroyed. 367 people had been killed, 18 of whom were members of the emergency services. Thousands more were wounded or traumatized. The city centre was reduced to smoking ruins, and Salford and Stretford had also been hit hard.
I went to work next morning. In those days, if you had a bad night, you still turned up at work. I went by bicycle because the transport was very disrupted. And when I got to Oxford Road on the level with the Royal Infirmary, began to encounter hosepipes across the road. As you got nearer into town, you could see the buildings blazing, particularly the ones in Portland Street. And there obviously was glass and water and these hosepipes all over the road until I got to my workplace on Deansgate. And because of the situation, we had to go into work each day, including Christmas Day. But my grandmother, who lived in Withington, managed to put on a Christmas dinner, and they had a family of 5 staying with them who'd been bombed out of their home in Moss Side. I don't think they knew them at all, but they just took them in. People did that sort of thing during the Blitz.
I went into Manchester, and there's Mosley Street, and there was another block came up, and I don't know whether they called it Swan Street, but there was a huge bedding warehouse there that completely disappeared.
I can still see now the fires, you know, on Piccadilly and that, all the where all the warehouses were, you know, all blazing.
There were rumours that the Luftwaffe would come again, but there was to be a Christmas truce, arranged through diplomatic channels for all theatres of operations, but nobody was told about it, and anyway, there was little left for the German planes to do. The Luftwaffe bombed British cities far more accurately than we were later to bomb theirs. They used X-Verfahren, Y-Verfahren and Knickerbeam, radio direction finding beams that guided the bombers to their targets. Where they crossed, that triggered the automatic release of bombs. For Manchester, the aiming point was the city centre. On the nights of Manchester's Blitz, the beams crossed almost directly above this pub. So the pre-Christmas drinkers in the Wellington and Sinclairs were theoretically the targets for almost every bomb that dropped on Manchester. X-Verfahren, Y-Verfahren and Knickerbeam were the Luftwaffe's first secret weapons, but they weren't so secret. The British had broken Germany's top secret code, and Manchester could have been warned before the Blitz, had it not been for the fact that to have done so would have jeopardized the work of Britain's top code breakers, one of whom, incidentally, was Dr. Thuring from Manchester University. His invaluable contribution to the war effort has been recognised in Manchester. They've named a road after him.
Now, our own air raid shelter was a brick thing, but it had a concrete top on, but it backed onto one next door. There was a dividing wall. Now, that wall didn't go right to the roof of the air raid shelter, and I think the idea was that if one side got damaged, you could climb through into the other side. But that was very good because you would be sat in the shelter, you know, when a raid was on, and you would be talking to your next door neighbours who would be sat at the other side. You couldn't see them, but you had some very interesting conversation. I think you got to know your neighbours really well because of that. It was certainly a time when everybody got on with everybody. It was unique, I think. I think we're all in the same blinking boat, so we all made the best of it. I mean, if one of the ladies found they had, well, not bananas, fish at some shop, she'd be down, they've got fish at Gosling's, and all the women had come out with the bags and they'd be all queuing up.
As I negotiated the craters in the roadway in Gorse Hill, I eventually arrived at Warwick Road, where I turned left towards Manchester United football ground, because beyond that was Glover's, the firm I worked for, and Trafford Park generally, which contained many firms important to the war effort, such as Metropolitan Vickers Electrical Company, Carborundum Limited, even Ashworth the timber merchants, and many other firms. I entered the premises of Glover's to be met by a tall, handsome lady in a tailored suit with a flower in her left buttonhole. She greeted me with open arms, which surprised me because I was a mere secretary and she was secretary to Major Chandler, the managing director. There was a kind of upper crust level, you know. Anyway, she patted me on the back, metaphorically, and perhaps literally as well, because she said Hitler was trying to disrupt the functioning of Trafford Park with all the firms who were involved in the war effort, so that anybody who stayed away from work was disrupting the functioning of their company. So I, a mere secretary, ordinary secretary, was to be congratulated on turning up for work in spite of a difficult journey.
Trafford Park, Manchester's arsenal, was badly hit during the Blitz, and the production of 25-pounder field guns, searchlights, radar and other military hardware was interrupted. But it was soon restored as workers cleared rubble from benches and patched up broken machinery. Later, they were to manufacture the equipment that was used to jam the Germans' revolutionary bomb-aiming devices, and so they helped to save other cities from the fate they themselves had suffered.
But the Luftwaffe were not finished. Through January, March and into May, bombs fell in Gorton Hyde Road, Withington, Moss Side and in Wood Street. Many a Coronation Street disappeared in rubble, and Hope Hospital lost 6 staff. In June, the Café Royal, the Gaiety Theatre and the Theatre Royal had their turn in the drama. Bombs with Happy Whitsuntide painted on the side destroyed the frontage of Salford Royal Hospital, killing 14 nurses. The hospital is boarded up today, waiting for redevelopment. But the rebuilt frontage is there for all to see, and a plaque recalls the tragedy of those desperate days. But Manchester knew what she had to do. Women worked as never before, and the conditions in Trafford Park factories changed forever.
Got on.
Some of these days you're gonna miss me hearty. Some of these days you're gonna be so lonely. You'll miss my hearty. You're gonna miss my kisses. You'll miss me hearty when I'm far away. You'll be so lonely just for me only. Cause you know, honey, you always had your way. And when you leave me, I just know it's going to grieve me. You're going to miss your big fat mama, just your red hot mama, some of these days. These days, you're gonna be so lonely. Some of these days, you're gonna be so lonely. You'll miss my hearty. You're gonna
For Manchester and district, the worst was now over, as the RAF took command of the skies, and Germany turned her attention on Russia. Manchester's Dunlop factory made barrage balloons, and the young women of the WAAF flew them to protect the city from surprise attack. Manchester Airport not only became a base for the design, testing and manufacture of aircraft, but also the parachute training school for 62,000 airborne troops.
As daring but more clandestine were the agents recruited by the Special Operations Executive, operating from the airfield. It was from here, Building 217, that agents were trained and then dropped behind enemy lines into occupied France. Often, as in the case of Violette Jabot, immortalized by the film Carve Her Name with Pride, falling into the hands of the dreaded Gestapo and suffering torture and then summary execution in a concentration camp.
Deserted and derelict now, these rooms and corridors were once the last comfortable quarters that many secret agents, trained at Ringway, were housed in. Jean Moulin, de Gaulle's chief of resistance, stayed here before being dropped back into France. He was betrayed to and then murdered by Gestapo chief Klaus Barbie, also known as the Butcher of Lyon. The tide of war had turned, but there were still one or two surprises yet to come. The V-1s in the attack of the 24th of December 1944 were air-launched from converted Heinkel bombers over the North Sea. Only one flying bomb landed on Manchester, doing little damage, but the one that landed on Oldham killed 28 people.
For Hitler was the last throw of the dice. Britain had not been broken by the Luftwaffe's bombs, and the Führer's rockets had come too late. The victims of Manchester's Blitz are buried in cemeteries all round the city and throughout Greater Manchester. Here in Southern Cemetery, in front of a simple rose garden, is a memorial to 122 of them.
Whole families had been wiped out. Nobody knows precisely how many died. The best estimate is over 1,000, many dying later of their wounds. 4 more died in hospital as a result of the V1 attack on Oldham. A further 7 were killed at Tottington. 4 more by rockets falling elsewhere around Greater Manchester. The raid was totally unexpected. They'd thought it was all but over.
These green lawns are the mass graves for the victims of a people's war. Manchester had fought her war with her science, her industry, and her servicemen and women. She'd endured the worst. And just as London had boasted to the world that she could take it, Manchester had shown that she could take it too.
We've got our troubles and we've got our cares, but as long as we keep smiling through, there'll come a day when the clouds roll away and the sun will be shining anew. When the sounds are lost so clear, how happy my darling